Welcome back to the Somnorian. Get comfortable, dim the lamp if you haven't already, pull the blanket up to wherever feels right and let the room go quiet around you. Tonight we're staying in 12th century Paris, and I promise you can close your eyes. Nothing here needs watching, only listening. If this channel helps you drift off, a like or a subscribe genuinely does help it reach other people looking for the same thing at 1 in the morning. But only if you actually enjoy it, no pressure at all. And before we begin, I always love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what hour is it where you are? Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. Now settle in, because we're going to talk about the most famous love affair the Middle Ages ever produced, and it starts, as so many disasters do, with a very talented man who was extremely sure of himself. His name was Peter Abelard, and by the year 1115 he was, without much competition, the most celebrated teacher in Paris. This was the generation just before the University of Paris formally existed, when the schools meant clusters of students gathering around whichever master could hold a crowd on the left bank, and the little bridges of the Ile de la Cité paying him directly for the privilege of listening. Abelard held crowds better than anyone. He taught logic and theology. He demolished older, established masters in public debate. He had already humiliated his own former teacher, William of Champeaux, badly enough to drive William's career sideways, and he did it all with the swagger of a man who knew the students would follow him wherever he set up his lectern. He came from minor Breton nobility in a place called Le Palais, near Nantes, and he had given up his inheritance and any claim to a knightly career to become, essentially, a professional arguer. In the terms of his own century, that was an eccentric choice. In ours, he was a tenured track star academic with a very large personal following and, by his own admission, an ego to match. We know all this in unusual detail for a medieval life because Abelard later wrote it down himself in a long autobiographical letter called the Historia Calamitatum, the history of my calamities, and the title alone should tell you how the story goes. By his own account, he had until this point been almost monkishly indifferent to romance, too absorbed in his work and his reputation to bother. Then he noticed a young woman named Eloise. She was the niece of a canon of Notre Dame named Fulbert, a cleric attached to the cathedral, and she lived in Fulbert's house in the cathedral close, right in the heart of the city. What made Eloise remarkable, and this is not Abelard flattering himself because other writers of the period noted it independently, was that she was famous throughout Paris for her learning. She read Latin fluently, she was said to know some Greek and Hebrew, and she was regarded as one of the most educated people of any gender in the city. In an age when the literacy rate hovered somewhere in the low single digits, and formal education for women was rare enough to be genuinely newsworthy, a teenage girl with a reputation for scholarship was a phenomenon. Fulbert was proud of her the way you are proud of something you consider partly your own achievement, and he wanted her educated further. So he did something that, in retrospect, ranks among the worst hiring decisions in recorded history. He invited the most famous, most charismatic bachelor scholar in Paris to move into his house and tutor his brilliant young niece, one-on-one. And, because Abelard offered to pay room and board in exchange, he essentially handed him unsupervised access. It's the setup to a cautionary tale so obvious that even Abelard, writing years later, admits he could hardly believe his luck. He compared Fulbert handing Eloise over to his instruction to entrusting a tender lamb to a ravenous wolf. He was not being modest. He knew exactly what he was doing when he moved in. And here we should slow down and be honest about what this actually was, because the sources are unusually frank, and it does the story no favours to prettify it. Abelard was at this point somewhere around 35 years old, and at the height of his fame and authority. Heloise's exact age is debated, but the traditional accounts put her in her mid to late teens. Some modern historians argue she may have been a little older, in her early 20s, but every version has her as a young student, and him as the older, powerful master brought in specifically to teach her. He tells us, without any apparent shame, that he pursued her deliberately, that lessons became a pretext, and that, in one of the more quoted lines of the whole confession, with their books lying open before them, more words of love passed between them than of instruction, and there was more kissing than teaching. This was a private tutor exploiting the total, trusting access a guardian had given him to his teenage charge. By the standards of any century, it is a serious abuse of position, and it's worth saying plainly before we let the romance of it take over, because the reason we remember Eloise at all is that she turned out to be a far deeper and more formidable person than the girl Abelard thought he was seducing. The tragedy of the story is partly that she deserved a better partner in it than the vain man who started it. For a while, though, they got away with it, in the way that people getting away with something always assume will last longer than it does. Abelard, distracted, began to neglect his lectures. His students noticed that the master who had once dazzled them was now visibly phoning it in, showing up unprepared, repeating old material and, most tellingly for a man whose whole identity was his brilliance, writing love songs instead of philosophy. He mentions, almost in passing, that he composed songs and verses to Eloise that became popular and were sung around Paris, so widely known that people who had no idea who inspired them were humming them in the streets. Sit with that for a second. The affair was so poorly hidden that the man was releasing, and I use the word advisedly, chart-topping love singles about his own secret girlfriend, and the whole city was singing along without knowing they were listening to evidence. Everyone in Paris apparently understood what was going on before the one person whose house it was happening in. Fulbert, the sources agree, was the last to know. The trusting uncle upstairs, while the entire left bank hummed the soundtrack of what was happening under his roof. When Fulbert finally did find out, and the accounts suggest he walked in on them, or something close to it, he threw Abelard out of the house in a fury, and the lovers were separated. But the damage, in the most literal sense, was done. Eloise was pregnant. Abelard's response was to spirit her out of Paris entirely. He arranged for her to be smuggled out of Fulbert's house disguised, dressed he says as a nun, and sent to his own family in Brittany, to his sister's household back near Le Palais, where she gave birth to a son. And here is one of my favourite strange details in the whole affair, a small thing that tells you these were real, specific people, and not romantic archetypes. They named the boy Astrolabe, after the astronomical instrument. Picture two of the most intellectually intense people in Europe, in the middle of the most consequential crisis of their lives, looking at their newborn son and deciding to name him after a piece of scientific equipment, roughly the modern equivalent of naming your child telescope or sextant, and meaning it as the highest possible compliment. It is the single most on-brand thing two 12th century scholars could possibly have done, and it is completely, verifiably true. With the pregnancy resolved and the child safe in Brittany, Abelard went to Fulbert to try to make peace. And here the story turns on a genuine collision of values that is worth understanding, because it's the hinge everything else swings on. Abelard offered to marry Eloise. To Fulbert, whose family honour had been publicly damaged, this was the obvious repair, and he agreed. But there was a catch that Abelard insisted on, and it reveals the strange bind he was in. He wanted the marriage kept secret. The reason was his career. Abelard was a cleric. He was in holy orders, which was simply what a professional scholar in this world normally was, since the schools were church institutions and teaching was a clerical path. He had not been ordained a priest, and technically the rules around marriage and clerical careers were murkier than they'd later become. But the powerful cultural expectation, hardening in exactly these decades, was that the top rank of scholars and churchmen lived celibate. A publicly married Abelard would be a diminished Abelard, a man who had traded the highest reaches of a philosophical and ecclesiastical career for domestic life. A secretly married one could, he imagined, have both. It was essentially the 12th century version of not putting the relationship on any of your professional profiles because it might affect the promotion, except the stakes were his entire identity as the greatest mind of his age, and he wanted Heloise to accept second billing to that identity forever. And now we come to the part of the story that flips it inside out, because Heloise, the teenage student, the seduced pupil, turns out to have the sharpest mind and the strongest convictions of anyone in it. She did not want to marry him. Not because she didn't love him. She argued ferociously, precisely because she loved him, that marriage would ruin him. She told him, and he records her arguments at length and with evident awe years later, that it would be a disgrace for a philosopher to be shackled to the domestic grind of a wife and household, that great thinkers should not be distracted by squalling infants and the smell of cooking and the endless small demands of a family, and, most radically, that she would rather be called his mistress or even his whore than his empress, because love freely given was worth more than love bound by a contract. She quoted Cicero and Seneca and the church fathers to make the case. She out-argued him on his own philosophical turf, deploying classical authorities to prove that a wife was beneath the dignity of a true philosopher, and that she wanted no legal hold over him, only his freely chosen affection, she essentially looked at the institution of marriage, the thing every woman of her era was told was her single most important goal, and delivered a rigorous, source-cited argument that it was a trap for the mind and a cheapening of real love. It is one of the most striking pieces of writing to survive from any medieval woman, and the man she was arguing with steamrolled her anyway. Abelard insisted they married secretly in Paris with a few witnesses, and then, per the plan, they separated again and lived apart to keep the marriage hidden, seeing each other only occasionally and in secret. The secret marriage promptly did exactly what secrets do, which is fail at the worst possible moment. Fulbert and his household, humiliated and wanting the marriage known to restore the family's honour, began to let it be known around Paris that the two were married, which was the entire thing Abelard had married her to avoid becoming public. Heloise, loyal to Abelard's career even now, publicly denied it, swearing the marriage wasn't real, which put her in the impossible position of protecting his reputation by staining her own. The friction between Heloise and her uncle's household grew ugly enough. There are hints Fulbert may have mistreated her, that Abelard once again removed her, sending her out of the city to a convent at Argenteuil, a place she knew well, and having her dress in the habit of a nun, though she had taken no vows. And this, to Fulbert and his relatives, looked like the final betrayal. It looked as though Abelard, having ruined the girl and secretly married her, was now shoving her into a nunnery to be rid of her and free himself, dissolving the marriage that was supposed to have repaired the family's honour. They concluded that Abelard had discarded her, and they decided on a revenge so specific and so brutal that it has echoed through 9 centuries of retellings and never once lost its power to make an audience wince. I'll tell it the way the sources tell it, plainly, because the plainness is the horror. One night, Fulbert's kinsman bribed Abelard's own servant to let them into the house where he was sleeping. They fell on him in his bed, held him down, and castrated him. That is the calamity at the centre of the history of my calamities, the injury that ended in a single, violent night, both the physical relationship and the ordinary future of the most famous man in Paris. The reaction of the city tells you how shocking even a hard medieval public found it. Word spread by morning, and Abelard writes that crowds gathered, that people wept and cried out, and that the clerics, and especially his own students, made such a lamentation that he was tormented more by their grief and pity than by the wound itself. The law for once moved fast and hard against the attackers. This was a mutilation of a prominent cleric, and the authorities took it seriously. 2 of the perpetrators who could be caught, including the bribed servant, were sentenced to be blinded and castrated themselves. An exact and deliberate mirroring of the crime, the medieval justice system answering atrocity with symmetrical atrocity. Fulbert himself, the canon of Notre Dame, had his property confiscated and was, for a time, driven from the city in disgrace. Nobody in this story escapes it intact. That is rather the point of it. What happened next is the part that turns a lurid scandal into one of the enduring stories of Western literature, because both of them survived the catastrophe and became, in their separate ruins, more than they had been. Abelard, shattered and humiliated, did the thing a man of his world did with a shattered public life. He became a monk, taking vows at the great royal abbey of Saint-Denis just north of Paris. And, because he could not stop being Abelard even after everything, he insisted, as a condition of his own retreat into religion, that Heloise take vows too, becoming a nun at Argenteuil. She obeyed him, and here is the detail that has broken hearts for 900 years and tells you everything about the imbalance that ran through the whole affair. She did not do it out of any religious calling. She said so, plainly, later. She entered the convent at his command purely because he told her to, and as she took the veil she's said to have wept and quoted a line from the Roman poet Lucan, the words of Cornelia mourning her husband Pompey, blaming herself for a great man's downfall. She was somewhere around 20. She would spend the rest of her long life as a nun, and eventually as a highly respected abbess, running the convent of the Paraclete, an oratory Abelard himself founded and later granted to her, where she proved to be a formidable and admired administrator. Because of course she did. She was the most capable person in the story from the beginning. But that is not quite where I want to leave the 2 of them tonight, because the reason we still say their names is not the scandal or the mutilation, but what came afterward. In ink. Years later, both of them now middle-aged, both bound by monastic vows, living apart in their separate religious houses, Heloise got hold of a copy of Abelard's Historia Calamitatum, the autobiography he'd written as a letter of consolation to some other troubled friend. Reading his account of their shared catastrophe reopened everything for her, and she wrote to him. What follows is the correspondence that made them immortal, a series of letters, preserved and copied and pored over ever since, in which Heloise writes with a raw, unguarded, almost frightening honesty about a love that has not cooled in her at all. She tells him, a professed nun writing to a monk, that she still thinks of their intimacy during Mass itself, that the pleasures they shared are so dear to her she can neither forget them, nor even wish to, that she has taken the outward form of religion without any of the inward conviction, and that she has been called chaste by people who do not know that she is only a hypocrite. She confronts him too with a wound sharper than any physical one. She notes that in all his long letter of self-pity he had not written to comfort her, that she who gave up everything at his word had been met with his silence. And Abelard, chastened, older, genuinely trying now to be the spiritual guide he thought he ought to be, writes back attempting to redirect all of it upward, urging her to love God rather than him, to see the castration as a mercy that freed them both from sin, to become, in effect, his sister in Christ rather than his lost wife. It is one of the most extraordinary two-sided documents to survive from the Middle Ages. One person still openly, defiantly in love, and the other person carefully, insistently trying to file that love under a different heading. Whether you read it as a spiritual triumph or as one last act of him telling her what to feel, probably says more about you than about them, and I gently suggest you don't have to decide tonight. They never lived together again, and as far as we know, they met rarely, if ever, after the letters. Yet Abelard's later years were consumed by exactly the kind of intellectual combat he had always thrived on. His theological writings were formally condemned as heretical at the Council of Soissons, and again, near the end of his life, at the Council of Sens in 1141, where he was hounded by the most powerful churchman of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux. He set out for Rome to appeal, fell ill on the way, and died in 1142 at a priory near Chalons, worn out and defeated at around 63. His body was quietly sent to Heloise at the Paraclete, because he had asked to be buried there, in her keeping. She outlived him by more than 20 years, running her convent with a competence and reputation that drew respect from across the church, and when she died, around 1164 in her 60s, she was, by her own long-standing request, buried beside him. And the two of them have been rearranged, disinterred and reburied together so many times over the following 7 centuries, moved from the Paraclete through the upheavals of the French Revolution, and eventually installed in an elaborate neo-Gothic tomb, that today you can go and stand over a monument in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, where a tremendous stone canopy shelters 2 carved figures lying side by side. Abelard and Heloise, reunited in death far more reliably than they were ever allowed to be in life, and visited still by people who leave letters. Whether the right bones are actually under that particular slab is a question historians have argued about for 200 years, and will probably never settle, which feels for these two almost perfectly appropriate. Even now, nobody can quite agree on the truth of them, and the argument itself has become part of the love story. Chapter 2. The queen who divorced a king and married his rival. Eleanor of Aquitaine is arguably the single most consequential woman of the entire medieval period, which makes it all the more delicious that the pivot her whole life turns on is, at bottom, a story about a woman leaving a man she found boring for a younger, more exciting one, and reshaping the map of Europe on her way out the door. Start with what she actually was, because the scale of it is easy to underestimate from a modern vantage where Duchess sounds decorative. Eleanor was born around 1122 as the heiress to the Duchy of Aquitaine, and Aquitaine was not a minor holding. It was an enormous, wealthy, sun-warmed swath of what is now southwestern France, larger than the lands the King of France directly controlled, running from the Loire down toward the Pyrenees and out to the Atlantic coast, encompassing Poitou and Gascony, and the great pilgrimage roads and the vineyards and the ports. When her father, Duke William X, died suddenly in 1137 while on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, this vast territory landed on a girl of about 15, which, in the political physics of the 12th century, made her not a person, but a prize, the single most eligible heiress in Christendom, and a security problem that had to be solved immediately before some ambitious neighbour solved it by force. The man who solved it fastest was Louis VI of France, known as Louis the Fat, who was himself dying at the time and moved with the speed of a man who knows a once-in-a-century opportunity when he sees one. Within weeks of Duke William's death, he had betrothed Eleanor to his own son and heir, the younger Louis, and had the boy hurried south under heavy escort to marry her in Bordeaux. It was a spectacular land grab dressed as a wedding. At a stroke, the French crown was set to absorb the largest duchy in the kingdom. The two teenagers were married in the summer of 1137 in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux, and within days, while they were still making their way back north, word arrived that old Louis the Fat had died of dysentery. So the couple who had ridden south as a prince and his bride arrived back in Paris as King Louis VII and Queen Eleanor of France. She was around 15. He was around 16 or 17. Neither of them had asked for any of it, and it would take about 15 years for the full mismatch to reveal itself. But the seed of the whole scandal was planted right there in that rushed dynastic transaction. Two profoundly incompatible young people welded together for the sake of a map. Because they were incompatible, and the sources are fairly clear about the shape of it. Eleanor came from the court of Aquitaine, the most sophisticated, pleasure-loving, culturally dazzling court in Europe. Her own grandfather, William IX, had been the first known troubadour, a duke who wrote frank and witty poetry about love and sex and set the tone for a court that prized music, verse, elegance, and a certain sun-drenched worldliness. Eleanor arrived in Paris expecting something like that, and found instead a cold, austere, rain-soaked northern city, and a husband who had been raised, before his older brother's death unexpectedly made him heir, to become a churchman. Louis VII was pious to the point of monkishness, devout, gentle, earnest, given to fasting and prayer and long consultations with clergy, and by every account he was genuinely, helplessly in love with his glamorous southern wife, in a way that made him anxious rather than commanding. There's a much-repeated later remark, attributed to observers of the marriage, that Louis loved Eleanor almost like a man in the grip of an infatuation he couldn't manage, while she is said to have complained that she had married a monk and not a king. Whether or not she used those exact words, the sentiment runs through everything that followed. She was worldly, forceful, and used to a court where a great lady's opinions mattered. He was uncertain and controlled by his clergy, and the marriage produced, over its first many years, only daughters, no son, no heir, which in the arithmetic of medieval kingship was treated as a slow-building crisis, regardless of whose fault anyone imagined it to be. The thing that cracked the marriage open, though, was not the daily friction of temperament, but a genuinely extraordinary shared adventure that went spectacularly wrong: the Second Crusade. In 1147, Louis VII took the cross and set out for the Holy Land to shore up the Crusader states in the east, and Eleanor, and this is remarkable in itself, went with him, not as a symbolic gesture, but at the head of her own Aquitanian vassals, bringing the fighting men of her duchy as part of the army. The image of Eleanor riding to crusade later generated wild legends, including the entirely apocryphal but wonderfully persistent story that she and her ladies rode dressed as Amazons. You can safely file that one under myth. What is not myth is that the crusade was a disaster, militarily and personally. The French army was mauled crossing Anatolia, and by the time the royal party reached Antioch in 1148, the marriage was visibly failing under the strain. And it was in Antioch that the affair, or the accusation of an affair, detonated. Antioch was ruled by Raymond of Poitiers, who happened to be Eleanor's uncle, her father's younger brother, a charming and handsome man close enough to her in age and background to feel less like an uncle and more like a countryman in a foreign land. Eleanor and Raymond got on immediately and famously well. They spoke the same language, literally the Languedoc of the south, and shared the same warm Aquitanian sensibility Louis so conspicuously lacked, and Raymond wanted the French army to help him campaign against the nearby Muslim-held city of Aleppo, which made strategic sense for Antioch. Eleanor sided openly and forcefully with her uncle's plan against her husband's wishes, and the closeness between uncle and niece became the subject of loud whispering in the Crusader camp. Contemporary and near-contemporary chroniclers, including the well-connected John of Salisbury, who was at the papal court and heard the fallout directly, record that the intimacy between Eleanor and Raymond became a scandal, that people muttered about it, and that Louis grew jealous and suspicious. Whether anything improper actually happened between Eleanor and her uncle is genuinely unknowable and probably unlikely. What matters historically is that the appearance of it, combined with Eleanor's open political defiance, ruptured the marriage in public view. When Louis decided to leave Antioch and press on to Jerusalem, Eleanor refused to go with him, and according to John of Salisbury, she went further, saying openly that she wanted the marriage annulled and reaching for the one weapon that could actually dissolve it. She pointed out that she and Louis were related within the forbidden degrees of kinship, that they were, by the Church's own accounting, too closely related to be validly married at all. She was, in effect, drawing up the legal grounds for her own divorce in the middle of a failed holy war, standing in her uncle's city, telling the King of France she was done. Louis had her removed from Antioch essentially by force, and the two continued on to Jerusalem estranged, the crusade limping to its humiliating collapse around them. Here we have to pause on the legal machinery, because the Queen of France got a divorce. Sounds simple, and was anything but, and the specific mechanism is the whole hinge of the story. Medieval Christian marriage was, in theory, indissoluble. You could not simply divorce. What you could do was get a marriage annulled, declared to have never been validly a marriage in the first place, and the most reliable grounds for that among the aristocracy was consanguinity. The Church forbade marriage between people related within a certain number of degrees, and the tangled, intermarried nobility of Europe could almost always find a shared ancestor if they went looking. The exquisite irony is that everyone had known Louis and Eleanor were distantly related from the very beginning. It simply hadn't mattered, while the marriage was useful. Consanguinity was a door that stayed conveniently locked until one or both parties wanted out, at which point the relevant genealogy was suddenly discovered and produced. On the way home from the catastrophic crusade, the estranged couple stopped in Italy and were met by the Pope himself, Eugenius III, who tried desperately to save the marriage. He is reported to have reconciled them, even personally seeing them into a shared bed hung with his own precious fabrics, in an attempt to get an heir out of them and glue the thing back together. It briefly worked, at least biologically. Eleanor conceived and bore another child. But it was another daughter, and a second daughter, after 15 years with no son in sight and the personal relationship in ruins, was the end. Both parties now wanted out, and once the king himself wanted the annulment, the machinery moved smoothly. In March of 1152, a council of French clergy at Beaugency solemnly declared the marriage of Louis VII and Eleanor null on the grounds of that long-ignored consanguinity. Their daughters were declared legitimate anyway, a tidy bit of ecclesiastical having it both ways, and Eleanor, at around 30, walked away a free woman, and crucially walked away with Aquitaine, which reverted entirely to her as her own inheritance. And this is the moment the story stops being a sad royal divorce and becomes one of the great scandals and strategic masterstrokes of the age, because of what Eleanor did next, and how fast she did it. A newly single Eleanor was, once again, the greatest heiress in Europe, and now an unsupervised one. A woman in sole possession of the largest duchy in France, with no husband and no male guardian, riding home to Poitiers to reclaim her lands. She was, in the bluntest terms, the most dangerous loose asset on the continent, and she knew it. On the journey south, she reportedly had to dodge at least 2 separate attempts by ambitious nobles to kidnap and forcibly marry her, because marrying Eleanor by abduction was a genuine and rational, if appalling, strategy for a lord looking to acquire a duchy overnight. She evaded them all and got home, and then, a mere 8 weeks after her marriage to the King of France was dissolved. 8 weeks. She married a man named Henry of Anjou. Let's take the measure of Henry, because the choice is the scandal and the genius fused into one decision. Henry was Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He was about 18 or 19 years old to Eleanor's roughly 30, and this is the part that turns a personal remarriage into an act of continental war. He was the heir to the throne of England, in the middle of pressing his claim against King Stephen in a long English civil war he was on the verge of winning. Eleanor had met Henry the previous year, when he and his father had visited the French court. The chroniclers hint, with varying degrees of scandalised relish, that something had passed between them even then, while she was still married to Louis, that the attraction was immediate and mutual, and that the annulment and the lightning remarriage were less a coincidence than a plan executed the moment the law allowed it. So consider the full shape of what she did, laid out plainly. Eleanor left a pious, gentle, older-feeling king she found tediously monkish, and 8 weeks later married a man 11 or 12 years her junior, vigorous, ferociously energetic, famously restless, already a duke and count in his own right and about to be a king. She traded up in age, in temperament, and in raw ambition, and she did it so fast that the ink was barely dry on her freedom. If you strip away the medieval trappings, it is the most archetypal she left him for a younger man story imaginable, except that the younger man came with the crown of England attached. The consequences of that 8-week decision are almost impossible to overstate, and this is where the deadpan has to give way for a moment to sheer scale. Louis VII had let Eleanor go partly on the reasonable assumption that a divorced woman's lands would come back into the French orbit eventually one way or another. Instead, by marrying Henry, Eleanor handed her enormous Duchy of Aquitaine to the man who, the very next year, would become King Henry II of England. When Henry took the English throne in 1154, the combined holdings of the couple stretched from the border of Scotland down through England, across the Channel to Normandy, through Anjou and Maine and Touraine, and all the way south through Eleanor's Aquitaine to the Pyrenees, a vast agglomeration of territory historians call the Angevin Empire, and one that meant the King of England now personally controlled more of France than the King of France did. Louis had, in effect, divorced his wife, and accidentally created the greatest strategic rival his dynasty would face for the next 300 years. The tangled, poisonous rivalry between the French crown and the English kings over these French lands, Eleanor's lands, would flare and smoulder generation after generation, and feed directly down the long chain of dynastic grievance into the 100 Years' War. It is not an exaggeration, only a compression, to say that one woman's decision about whom to marry after her divorce helped set the terms of English and French conflict for centuries. That is a spectacular amount of history to hang on 8 weeks, and a change of heart. The marriage to Henry was, for a good while, a genuine partnership, and by all appearances a passionate one, which stands out because Eleanor's first marriage had produced only 2 daughters, across 15 strained years, and her second produced 8 children in rapid succession, including 5 sons. She gave Henry the heirs Louis never got, among them 2 future kings of England, Richard the Lionheart and John, and this fertility after the barren years with Louis fueled a certain amount of unkind medieval commentary about whose fault the first marriage's childlessness had really been. For a time Eleanor and Henry ruled a sprawling empire together as formidable equals, and she was no ornamental consort. She governed, she held court, she administered Aquitaine, she was a political actor in her own right in a way almost no other woman of the century managed. But Henry II was every bit as strong-willed as she was, and considerably more prone to open infidelity. His affairs were notorious, most famously with a young woman named Rosamond Clifford, Fair Rosamond, around whom a whole thicket of romantic legend later grew, and a marriage of 2 dominant, ambitious people running a fractious empire eventually curdled the same way the first one had, only with far higher stakes and far sharper consequences. The break, when it came, was operatic even by the standards of this family. By the early 1170s, Eleanor had sided with her own sons in a great rebellion against Henry, the revolt of 1173-74, in which the young princes, egged on and supported by their mother and by her first husband Louis of France, who was delighted to make trouble for his rival, rose against their father to demand real power and real lands of their own. Eleanor, in her early 50s, was not a bystander to this. She was an active architect of it, backing her sons against her husband. And Henry, once he had crushed the rebellion, did something no other husband in these stories had the power to do. He caught Eleanor trying to flee to the French court, reportedly disguised as a man riding hard for safety, and he imprisoned her, not for a season, for roughly 16 years. From about 1173 until Henry's death in 1189, the woman who had been Queen of France and then Queen of England, who had ridden on crusade and governed a duchy and dissolved one royal marriage by sheer will, was kept under guard in various English castles, her freedom curtailed, trotted out occasionally for ceremonial purposes and then locked away again, while her husband ruled without her. It is the grimmest possible illustration of the limits even the most powerful medieval woman ran into. Eleanor could outmaneuver a king and reshape a continent, but she was still, in the end, a wife whose husband could imprison her for 16 years and largely get away with it. And then, because she was Eleanor of Aquitaine and the story simply refuses to end where you expect, she outlived him and won anyway. Henry II died in 1189, worn down and, by grim symmetry, betrayed at the last by the sons he had fought so hard to control, One of the very first acts of the new king, her beloved son Richard the Lionheart, was to order his mother released, and the woman who emerged from 16 years of confinement, now in her late 60s, did not retire quietly to a convent. She stepped straight back into power at the height of her abilities. While Richard was away on the Third Crusade and then held for ransom in a German prison, it was Eleanor, in her 70s, who effectively governed England in his name, who raised the colossal ransom demanded for his release, and personally escorted the treasure and her freed son home, and who held the fractious realm together against the scheming of her younger son John. She went on negotiating, travelling, and arranging the marriages of her grandchildren into her late 70s and beyond, most famously crossing the Pyrenees in her final years to personally select a granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, and deliver her to be married into the French royal house, ceding the very line she had once walked out of. She finally died in 1204, past 80, having been queen of 2 countries, mother of 2 kings, and grandmother of half the thrones of Europe, and she was buried at the Abbey of Fontevraud in Anjou, where you can still see her tomb effigy today, Eleanor carved in stone, lying in serene repose, and, in a detail that feels like her last quiet word to us across 8 centuries, depicted not praying but reading a book, the one figure among the royal effigies there caught in the act of doing exactly as she pleased. Chapter 3. The Empress and the Handsome Guardsman. If Eleanor spent her life proving that a woman could outmaneuver kings in the 12th century West, the Byzantine East had been running that same experiment at higher intensity and with better record-keeping for 500 years already. Constantinople was the largest, richest, most sophisticated Christian city on earth, an imperial capital of 500,000 people wrapped in triple walls, and its court was a place where a person of the right ambition and the wrong origins could rise from the absolute bottom of society to the very top, provided they were willing to marry, seduce, or outlive whoever stood in the way. And because the Byzantines were compulsive record keepers, and because their historians were often gloriously, viciously indiscreet, we know the intimate details of their imperial romances in a way we almost never do for the medieval West. The gossip survives. Tonight we get 2 of the best of it, separated by 5 centuries, both of them true, both of them the kind of story a modern network would immediately option, and then tone down for being implausible. Start with the greater of the 2, the one that sits at the very foundation of Byzantine legend, the Emperor Justinian and the Empress Theodora, in the first half of the 6th century. Justinian is one of the titans of the age, the emperor who reconquered Italy and North Africa, who built the Hagia Sophia, whose legal commission produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, the codification of Roman law that underlies much of European jurisprudence to this day. He was a driven, austere, workaholic administrator, a man of provincial peasant stock who had risen through the patronage of his uncle Justin, an illiterate ex-soldier who had improbably become emperor himself, and the woman Justinian chose to rule beside him, to make his empress and his closest political partner, came from a background so far beneath the imperial dignity that marrying her required literally changing the law of the empire. Because Theodora, before she was empress, had been an actress. And in 6th century Constantinople, actress was not a description of a profession so much as a legal and social category, roughly equivalent to a public prostitute. The stage, the circus, and sex work were tangled together in the law and the public mind, and the women of that world were placed near the very bottom of respectable society and formally barred from marrying into the high aristocracy, let alone the imperial family. Almost everything we know about Theodora's early life comes from a single, spectacular, and deeply hostile source, and we have to handle it with tongs, because it is one of the most delicious and least trustworthy documents to survive from antiquity. The historian Procopius was Justinian's official chronicler. He wrote admiring public histories of the emperor's wars and buildings. But he also secretly wrote a second book, unpublished in his lifetime, that only surfaced centuries later, a work known as the Secret History or Anecdota, and it is essentially a 100-page character assassination of Justinian and Theodora, dripping with venom, in which Procopius vents everything he could never say in public. In it he describes Theodora as the daughter of a bearkeeper for one of the great chariot racing factions of the Hippodrome, tells us she grew up in the raucous, disreputable world of the circus, went on the stage as a young girl and worked as a courtesan, and then goes considerably further into detailed, lurid, obviously exaggerated accounts of her supposed depravity that are so pornographically over the top, they read less like reporting than like a man trying to soil a memory as thoroughly as words allow. Historians now treat the secret history's sexual accusations as propaganda rather than fact, the fury of a disillusioned insider weaponizing the most shameful things he could invent or magnify. But the bare facts underneath the venom, that Theodora came from the world of the theatre and the circus, that she had been an actress of the disreputable kind, that she rose from real degradation, those are not seriously doubted, and they make what she became all the more staggering. Somewhere in her early 20s she seems to have left that life, undergone a religious conversion, worked for a time spinning wool in modest respectability, and then met Justinian, then the heir apparent and the most powerful man in the empire after his uncle. And he fell for her completely and refused to have her as anything less than his wife. And here the machinery of the state simply had to bend around a love affair, because the law flatly forbade the match. There was a statute on the books barring men of high senatorial rank from marrying actresses and women of that class. So Justinian had his uncle, the Emperor Justin, change the law. A new statute was issued that allowed a repentant former actress who had left her old life to marry into even the highest ranks. A law tailored so precisely to Theodora's exact situation that it functioned as a legislative wedding present. The imperial legal apparatus reprogrammed so that one specific man could marry one specific woman. They married around 525, and when Justinian became emperor in 527, the bearkeeper's daughter who had worked the stage of the Hippodrome was crowned Empress of the Romans and enthroned as the co-ruler of the wealthiest empire on earth. Justinian did not treat her as a decorative consort in the slightest. He called her his partner in deliberations, consulted her on matters of state, and issued laws in language acknowledging her counsel. An extraordinary public elevation of a woman from the very bottom of the social order to genuine shared sovereignty. And she earned it spectacularly, in the single most famous moment of both their reigns, the Nika riots of 532. The chariot racing factions of Constantinople, the Blues and the Greens, whose rivalry was part sports fandom, part street gang, part political movement, erupted into a citywide revolt that spiraled into an attempt to overthrow Justinian entirely, with a rival being acclaimed emperor in the Hippodrome and the city burning. Justinian and his court, besieged in the palace, were on the verge of fleeing. Ships were reportedly being readied to carry the emperor to safety, and the men in the room were arguing for escape. And then, according to Procopius, who in his public history records this admiringly, Theodora stood up and stopped them cold. She gave a short, ferocious speech arguing against flight, saying in effect that a fugitive emperor is worse than a dead one, that she would rather die an empress than live as an exile, and famously declaring that the imperial purple made a fine burial shroud, that royalty was worth dying in. Shamed and stiffened by her nerve, Justinian and his generals stayed, sent troops into the packed Hippodrome, and crushed the revolt in a massacre that reportedly left tens of thousands dead. The dynasty was saved, and it was saved because the former actress in the room had more steel in her than any of the generals. It is one of the great "the woman they all looked down on turns out to be the most formidable person present" moments in all of history, and it is not legend. It is in the official chronicle written by the same man who elsewhere tried to destroy her name. Theodora used her power, right up to her death from illness in 548, in ways that reflected where she had come from. She was a notable protector of women, backing legislation against forced prostitution, working to shut down brothels that trafficked poor girls, establishing a convent refuge on the far shore of the Bosphorus for former prostitutes, and pushing to expand the rights of women in divorce and property. A woman who had risen out of the sexual underclass of the capital spent her reign trying to build ladders and nets for the women still trapped in it. Justinian, for his part, never remarried after she died, ruled on alone for nearly 2 more decades, and built her memory into the very stones of the empire, most enduringly in the shimmering mosaic that still survives at the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, where Theodora stands in imperial purple and pearls and a halo of gold, jewelled and eternal, staring out across 1,500 years with the calm authority of a woman who was once the lowest kind of performer in Constantinople and ended as its empress. The bearkeeper's daughter got the last word in gold tile, and the man who wrote the secret history to defile her is remembered chiefly for having done so. Now spin the clock forward 5 centuries, to the year 1028, for the second romance, which trades the mythic grandeur of Theodora for something closer to pure soap opera, and is honestly the more purely entertaining of the two, precisely because the stakes are lower and the behaviour is worse. The central figure is Zoe Porphyrogenita, and her title tells you her status. Porphyrogenita means born in the purple, born to a reigning emperor in the special porphyry-lined chamber of the palace reserved for imperial births. She was the genuine article, dynastic legitimacy in human form, the daughter of Emperor Constantine VIII, and a direct heir of the great Macedonian dynasty that had ruled Byzantium at its height. The problem was that this priceless dynastic legitimacy had been, for most of her life, simply not used. Zoe spent her youth and middle age essentially sealed in the women's quarters of the palace, unmarried into her 50s, a princess whose value everyone acknowledged and no one had cashed in, while the dynasty slowly ran out of men. And then, in 1028, her father Constantine VIII lay dying with no son to succeed him, and the entire future of the Macedonian line suddenly rested on getting the middle-aged Zoe married to a suitable man, immediately, so that her husband could become emperor through her. They found her a groom named Romanos, an elderly senator, and married her off in a rush days before her father died. A marriage of pure state necessity between two people well past youth. Romanos III became emperor by marrying the princess, exactly as designed. And then the soap opera began, because Zoe, who had waited 50 years for a life, was not remotely satisfied with an elderly bureaucratic husband, and Romanos, for his part, quickly lost interest in the strenuous business of producing an heir with her, and turned his attention elsewhere, even reportedly cutting off her spending money and treating her with cold neglect. So Zoe did what a woman finally let out of a box after 50 years might do. She found someone she actually wanted. And the someone was a strikingly handsome young man of humble origins named Michael, the brother of a powerful palace eunuch, an official named John the Orphan Atrophus, who had shrewdly introduced his good-looking younger brother into the Empress's orbit. Zoe fell for Michael hard and openly. The sources describe her infatuation as barely concealed, her favour toward the young man obvious to the whole court, the ageing Empress lavishing attention on a beautiful commoner, young enough to be her son while her husband the Emperor looked increasingly like an obstacle. And then, in 1034, the obstacle removed itself in the bath. Emperor Romanos III was found dead in his bath, and essentially no one at the time believed it was an accident. The chronicler, Michael Psellos, one of the great and gossipy insider historians of Byzantium, who was close enough to these events to be a near-contemporary authority, records the widespread belief that Romanos was helped along, variously said to have been poisoned over a long period, and then, when the poison worked too slowly, held under the water of his bath until he drowned. Whether Zoe herself ordered it, knew of it, or merely benefited from it, has been argued ever since. Psellos strongly implies her complicity, or at least her convenient lack of curiosity. What is not in dispute is what happened next, and it is the detail that makes this the most brazen sequence in the whole imperial soap opera. On the very same day that Romanos's body was still lying in the palace, Zoe summoned her young lover Michael, dressed him in the imperial regalia, seated him on the throne, and had him proclaimed emperor, and then, that same day, sent for the Patriarch of Constantinople, the highest churchman in the empire, to come to the palace and marry them. The Patriarch arrived, reportedly took one look at the situation, a freshly dead emperor in one room and his widow demanding to be wed to a beautiful commoner in the next, and after a sum of gold changed hands to soothe his conscience, performed the wedding on the spot. Zoe married her lover and crowned him emperor before her murdered husband was even in the ground. The body was not yet cold and the paperwork was already done. The delicious final irony, because these stories rarely let anyone simply enjoy their scheming, is that Michael, once he was actually emperor as Michael IV, turned out to be nothing like the pliable young lover Zoe had installed. He was reasonably competent, he was chronically ill with epilepsy, and crucially he seems to have been genuinely afraid that Zoe would simply do to him what she had done to Romanos, replace him with the next handsome young man who caught her eye. So he had her watched, restricted her freedom, and shut her back out of power, and Zoe found herself once again confined and sidelined, having murdered her way to a husband who promptly imprisoned her in comfortable irrelevance exactly as her first arranged husband had. Her extraordinary later career would keep the soap opera running for years. She adopted Michael's nephew as heir. Then that ungrateful young man tried to shove her into a convent and shave her head, which provoked the population of Constantinople into a full-scale riot in her favour. the mob rising to restore the beloved born-in-the-purple princess and tear down the upstart who had insulted her. She was hauled back from the convent, briefly ruled alongside her equally elderly sister Theodora as co-empress, and finally, in her 60s, married a third time. Zoe of the Macedonian dynasty went through 3 husbands and 1 murdered emperor and a mob riot in her name, and died an empress in her own right, having spent the first 50 years of her life locked in a room and every year afterward making the entire empire pay interest on the delay. Chapter 4. The Adulterous Princesses of the Tour de Nesle. In 1314, the royal house of France looked, from the outside, like the most secure dynasty in Christendom. Philip IV, Philip the Fair, a cold, handsome, ruthless king who had crushed the Knights Templar, humiliated the Pope, and bent the French crown into the most powerful monarchy in Europe, sat on a throne backed by 3 grown sons, each already married, each a guarantee that the direct Capetian line, which had passed cleanly from father to son for over 300 years, would continue unbroken into the future. It was, by the standards of medieval dynastic planning, a near-perfect setup, a strong king and a wall of male heirs. And then, over a matter of months, the whole thing detonated, not from war, not from plague, not from rebellion, but from a sex scandal in the royal family so explosive that it helped bring that 300-year unbroken line to an end, and through the succession crisis it left behind, fed directly into the outbreak of the 100 Years' War. The whole catastrophe is known to history as the affair of the Tour de Nesle, and it began gloriously with a set of embroidered purses. Set the board first because the specific people matter. Philip IV had 3 sons who would each in turn briefly become king: Louis, Philip and Charles, and each of them was married to a young noblewoman. The eldest, Louis, was married to Margaret of Burgundy. The second son, Philip, was married to Joan of Burgundy, and the youngest, Charles, was married to Joan's sister, Blanche of Burgundy. So 2 of the royal daughters-in-law, Joan and Blanche, were sisters, and Margaret was their cousin, a tight little cluster of young women, connected by blood and marriage, all living within the intense, watched, gossipy world of the French court. Philip IV also had a daughter, Isabella, who by 1314 had been married off to King Edward II of England, and hold on to Isabella, because she is the hinge of the whole affair, and we will meet her again in her own right 2 chapters from now. For the moment, her role is that of the informant, because it was Isabella, the King of France's daughter, the Queen of England, who is traditionally credited with lighting the fuse, and she did it over a gift of purses. The story, as the chroniclers tell it, is almost novelistic in its neatness. Isabella, visiting the French court or receiving her sisters-in-law on a visit to England, the accounts vary, had given, as gifts, a set of finely embroidered purses to Margaret and Blanche, the wives of her brothers Louis and Charles. Some time later, back at the French court, Isabella noticed those same distinctive embroidered purses hanging from the belts of 2 Norman knights, brothers named Gautier and Philippe d'Aunay. Now, a lady's small personal gift turning up on the belt of a young knight was, in the coded language of courtly life, not nothing. Such tokens were exactly the kind of thing a woman gave to a man she favoured, a lover's keepsake worn as a quiet badge. Isabella, sharp-eyed and evidently suspicious of her sisters-in-law already, drew the obvious conclusion. The purses she'd given to Margaret and Blanche had been passed on to these 2 knights as love tokens, and the princesses were conducting affairs. She reported her suspicions to her father, Philip IV, and Philip the Fair was not a man to let a suspicion of adultery in the royal family go uninvestigated, because the stakes attached to it were nothing less than the legitimacy of future kings. That is the point that turns a bit of court gossip into a matter of state, and it's worth stopping on because it explains the ferocity of everything that followed. Adultery by a random noblewoman was a private sin and a family embarrassment. Adultery by the wives of the heirs to the throne was a dynastic weapon of mass destruction, because it poisoned the bloodline at its source. If a princess had taken a lover, then any child she bore might not be the king's grandchild at all, and the entire mechanism of hereditary succession, the thing the Capetians had relied on flawlessly for 3 centuries, depended absolutely on being able to trust that the children of the royal marriages were who they were supposed to be. A queen's fidelity was not a personal virtue, it was load-bearing infrastructure for the state. An adulterous royal wife could, in theory, put a false heir on the throne of France. So when Philip IV set his agents to watch Margaret, Blanche and the Daunet brothers, he was not indulging in jealous curiosity. He was conducting a security investigation into a threat against the succession itself. The investigation, once launched by a king with the full apparatus of the French state at his disposal, moved with terrifying efficiency, and what it found confirmed the worst of it. Margaret of Burgundy, wife of the heir Louis, and Blanche of Burgundy, wife of Charles, were determined to have been conducting adulterous affairs with Gautier and Philippe Daunet, and the trysts, according to the accounts, took place at a tower on the bank of the Seine in Paris called the Tour de Nesle, which is why the whole scandal carries that tower's name ever after. The third sister-in-law, Joan of Burgundy, wife of the middle son Philip, was implicated more ambiguously. She was accused not of committing adultery herself, but of knowing about her sisters' and cousins' affairs and helping to conceal them, of having facilitated the meetings and kept the secret, which, in the logic of the investigation, made her complicit even if her own bed was innocent. The two knights were arrested. The three princesses were arrested, and the interrogation of the Daunet brothers was conducted with the standard tool of a medieval justice for extracting confessions from commoners accused of a capital crime against the crown: torture. Under torture, the brothers confessed to the affairs, and this detail sharpens the horror considerably. They were said to have confessed that the relationships had been going on for some time, meaning the adultery was not a single indiscretion, but a sustained betrayal at the very heart of the royal house. What was done to the Daunet brothers, once convicted, is where the story stops being a titillating court scandal and becomes a genuine atrocity, and I'll give it to you as the sources do, because the sheer brutality of it tells you exactly how seriously the crown took a crime against the royal bloodline. The two knights were not simply executed. They were put to death by one of the most savage methods the medieval legal imagination could devise. According to the accounts, they were castrated, then flayed, their skins stripped from their bodies, and in some versions broken on the wheel and finally beheaded or hanged, their mutilated remains left on public display. The punishment was designed to be maximally degrading and maximally visible, a spectacle meant to broadcast the price of touching the wives of the sons of France. Two young knights who had, whatever else, only done what a great many courtiers did, carried on with willing married noblewomen, were destroyed with a theatrical cruelty reserved for traitors, because in the eyes of Philip the Fair that is precisely what they were: men who had committed treason against the future of the dynasty by corrupting the vessels of its bloodline. It is a grim illustration of the double standard baked into the whole system too, because the knights were tortured to death in public, while the princesses, being royal, faced a different fate. The princess's punishment was, on its face, less bloody, but in its own way it was a slower and arguably crueler destruction, and it is the part with the longest consequences. The three women were tried and stripped of their status. Margaret and Blanche, convicted of adultery, had their heads shaved and were imprisoned, sent to the fortress of Château Gaillard, the great castle Richard the Lionheart had built high above the Seine, and confined there in harsh conditions, in some accounts in an unheated underground cell, condemned to what was effectively a living entombment for their crime. Joan of Burgundy, convicted only of complicity and concealment, was treated somewhat more leniently, placed under house arrest at a royal residence, and here her fate diverges sharply from the others, because Joan had one crucial advantage. Her husband, the middle son Philip, believed in her innocence, or at least wanted to, and fought to have her rehabilitated. Her marriage was strong enough, and her husband's loyalty firm enough, that Joan was eventually cleared and restored to her position, which mattered enormously, as we'll see, because it meant that when her husband later became king, Joan became Queen of France, the one princess of the three to survive the scandal with her future intact. The other two were not so fortunate, and their misfortune became a dynastic catastrophe. Here is how a sex scandal broke a 300-year-old royal line, step by grinding step, and it turns on the fact that the wronged husbands were themselves the heirs to the throne. King Philip IV died in November 1314, only months after the scandal broke, and his eldest son ascended as Louis X. But Louis X had a problem that the scandal had created and could not be undone. His wife, Margaret of Burgundy, was imprisoned at Château Gaillard, convicted of adultery, and Louis desperately needed a new wife to give him a legitimate son, because his only child by Margaret was a daughter, and, crucially, that daughter's legitimacy was now under a permanent cloud, since if Margaret had been an adulteress, Who could swear the girl was truly the king's? Louis needed Margaret gone so he could remarry, and Margaret conveniently, or perhaps not so conveniently, died in her prison at Chateau Gaillard in 1315 of the cold and harsh conditions, according to the charitable accounts, or strangled on her royal husband's orders to free him to remarry, according to the persistent and darker rumour that has never been proven or dispelled. Either way, her death cleared the way, Louis X remarried, his new queen became pregnant, and then Louis X himself died suddenly in 1316, after a reign of less than 2 years, leaving his second wife pregnant with a child not yet born. And now the succession crisis that the scandal had seeded came to full poisonous flower. The kingdom waited for the posthumous child of Louis X to be born, and it was a boy, John I, king from the moment of his birth, the only French king to hold the crown for his entire life, because his entire life lasted 5 days. The infant king died at less than a week old. That left, as the senior surviving claimant, Louis X's daughter by the disgraced Margaret of Burgundy, a little girl named Joan, and here the earlier scandal did its final decisive damage. Because Margaret had been convicted of adultery, this daughter's paternity was tainted in exactly the way the whole system feared. No one could be certain she was truly the granddaughter of Philip the Fair, rather than the daughter of some lover in the Tour de Nesle. Her claim was fatally compromised by her mother's disgrace, and the great men of France, unwilling to risk the crown on a girl of doubtful blood, passed her over. They handed the throne instead to Louis X's next surviving brother, the middle son, Philip, whose own wife, Joan of Burgundy, had been the one princess cleared and restored, who became Philip V. And to justify excluding the little girl, French jurists reached back and dusted off, and arguably invented on the spot, the principle that would echo down the next several centuries, that a woman could not inherit the throne of France. This is the seed of what later hardened into the so-called Salic law, the doctrine barring female succession to the French crown. That doctrine, born to solve the mess the Tour de Nesle scandal had created, is what eventually lit the 100 Years' War, and the chain is direct enough to trace in a breath. Philip V ruled a few years and died leaving only daughters, barred now by the very principle he had benefited from. The crown passed to the last of Philip IV's 3 sons, Charles IV, whose own wife, remember, had been Blanche of Burgundy, the other convicted adulteress, imprisoned at Chateau Gaillard, so that Charles too had to have his disgraced marriage annulled and remarry in search of an heir, and Charles IV also died in 1328, leaving only daughters and no son. With that, all 3 sons of Philip the Fair were dead, every one of them having been forced by the scandal or its aftermath to grapple with a ruined marriage, and not one of them had produced a surviving legitimate son. The direct Capetian line, unbroken from father to son since 987, was extinguished. The crown passed to a cousin, Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI and founded a new dynasty. But there was another claimant with arguably a stronger blood tie. A man descended from Philip the Fair through the female line, through Philip's daughter Isabella, the very woman who had started the whole scandal by noticing those purses. Isabella's son was Edward III of England, and when Edward III pressed his claim to the throne of France through his mother, a claim the French rejected precisely by invoking that convenient rule against inheritance through a woman, the rule improvised to disinherit a little girl of doubtful paternity 14 years earlier. The argument over who should rightfully wear the crown of France became the great war that consumed both kingdoms for over 100 years. It is a genuinely staggering thing to trace. A chain of consequence running from 2 embroidered purses, through a tower on the Seine, through the flaying of 2 knights and the shaving of 3 princesses' heads, and the frozen cells of Chateau Gaillard, all the way to the fields of Crécy and Agincourt. Rarely in history has so much blood flowed over so long from a scandal that started with someone recognising a gift she'd given at a party. Chapter 5. The king who made his dead lover a queen. Some medieval love stories are scandalous because of the sex or the betrayal or the political wreckage they leave behind. This one is scandalous because of what a man did after the woman he loved was already dead, and it is the single most macabre romance in the whole European Middle Ages, a story so operatic that it sounds like something a Gothic novelist invented in a fever, except that it was recorded by chroniclers close to the events, and has been retold in Portugal as national history and national poetry for 600 years. It is the story of Pedro of Portugal and Inés de Castro, and its terrible climax involves a crown, a throne, and a corpse. Begin with Pedro, the Crown Prince of Portugal, born in 1320, the son and heir of King Afonso IV. Like every royal heir of his age, Pedro was a strategic asset whose marriage belonged to the state. And in 1339 his father arranged for him a suitable, politically valuable match. He married Constanza, a Castilian noblewoman of high rank, the daughter of a powerful Castilian lord, in the kind of alliance-sealing dynastic marriage that was the entire point of having a crown prince. And when Constanza came to Portugal to marry Pedro, she brought with her, as was normal for a great lady, a retinue of ladies-in-waiting from her Castilian household. Among them was a young woman of striking beauty named Inés de Castro, herself of Galician Castilian noble blood, an illegitimate but well-connected daughter of an important family, in service as one of Constanza's attendants. And Pedro, the newly married crown prince, took one look at his wife's lady-in-waiting and fell in love with her instead of with his wife, which is a very old and very human story, right up until you follow it all the way to its ending. The affair between Pedro and Inés became, quickly, an open and passionate one, conducted in the shadow of his marriage to Constanza, and it was a scandal at court for reasons that went well beyond ordinary marital betrayal, because it was politically dangerous in a way that alarmed the king. Inés de Castro had brothers, the Castro family, who were ambitious Castilian nobles, and Pedro's devotion to Inés drew these Castilian relations and their partisans into his inner circle, into the intimate orbit of the future King of Portugal. King Afonso IV watched his heir fall ever more deeply under the influence of a woman whose family represented a foreign Castilian interest, and he grew convinced that the Castros were using Inés as a channel to capture Pedro, to entangle the Portuguese crown in Castilian faction and dynastic ambition. So the affair was not merely an embarrassment to be tutted over. In the king's eyes it was a threat to the independence and integrity of the Portuguese royal house. Afonso tried to break it up. He sent Inés away from court, banished her from Portugal for a time, tried to force his son's attention back to his lawful wife and his dynastic duty. It did not work. Pedro's attachment to Inés only deepened, and when his wife Constanza died in 1345, after bearing Pedro the legitimate son he needed as an heir, the future Ferdinand I, the last restraining structure around the affair fell away. With Constanza dead, Pedro was free, or nearly so, and he and Inés now lived together openly as a couple, no longer a prince and his mistress in the margins of a marriage, but a devoted pair living as husband and wife in all but formal sanctioned law. They settled together, most famously near Coimbra, and Inés bore Pedro several children, sons and a daughter, a whole second family growing up alongside the legitimate heir Pedro had produced with Constanza. And this is exactly what turned the king's unease into something like dread, because those children were the crux of the danger. Pedro's children by Inés were, in the strict legal sense, illegitimate, but they were the sons of the future king, half-brothers to the legitimate heir, and they were half Castro, tied by blood to that ambitious Castilian family. King Afonso IV, and the Portuguese nobles around him, came to fear a nightmare scenario, that Pedro might one day try to legitimize these children, or that after Pedro's death the Castro-blooded sons might challenge the legitimate heir Ferdinand, dragging Portugal into a Castilian entangled succession war and threatening to subordinate the kingdom to Castilian interests. There was even a persistent belief that Pedro had secretly married Inés, which would make the whole calculation far more dangerous, since a secret marriage could turn those illegitimate children into legitimate rival heirs. The longer Inés lived, and the more sons she bore, the graver in the king's judgment the threat to the kingdom became, and so King Afonso IV made the coldest of political decisions, the kind that treats a human being purely as a problem to be removed. In 1355, while Pedro was away, the king consulted with 3 of his councillors, hard men who argued that Inés was a mortal danger to the realm and had to be eliminated, and Afonso, an old man persuaded that his kingdom's future required it, gave the order, or at least the permission. His 3 councillors rode to where Inés was living near Coimbra, at a place associated ever after with the tragedy, and there they killed her. The traditional account has Inés, understanding what was coming, pleading for her life in front of her young children, begging the king's men for mercy for the sake of her babies, and being murdered anyway, cut down or having her throat cut in front of them. Whether that specific scene of the weeping mother and the children is precise reportage or the shaping of later tradition, the core fact is solid and grim. On the king's authority, Inés de Castro was assassinated by royal agents, while the crown prince who loved her was away, killed as a matter of cold state policy to protect the succession. The place where it happened, a garden with a spring at the royal estate of Santa Clara in Coimbra, became a site of legend, and the story grew up that the spring itself wept, that the water ran forever after in mourning for her. When Pedro returned and learned what his own father had done, he did not grieve quietly. He went by the accounts half mad with grief and rage, and he did something almost unheard of. He rose in open rebellion against his father the king, raising forces and plunging the country towards civil war between the heir and the reigning monarch, father and son at war over the murder of a woman. The fighting and the crisis were real, and it took the intervention of others, including by tradition Pedro's own mother, the Queen, to broker a peace between father and son, and pull Portugal back from the brink. Pedro was outwardly reconciled to his father, but he did not forgive, and he did not forget, and he had the patience of a man who knows he will outlive the person he hates, because Afonso was old, and Pedro was the heir. He simply waited. He did not have to wait long. King Afonso IV died in 1357, and Pedro became King Pedro I of Portugal. And now the man who had lost Inés held absolute power, and he used it first for vengeance so exact and so ferocious that it earned him a pair of nicknames that capture the terrible duality of him. He's remembered as Pedro o Justicero, Peter the Justicer, the dispenser of harsh justice, and also as Pedro o Cruel, Peter the Cruel. He hunted down the men who had murdered Inés. 2 of the 3 councillors who had done the killing had fled to Castile, sensing exactly what was coming. Pedro arranged for them to be handed over, reportedly through a grim exchange of fugitives with the King of Castile, a trade of one country's wanted men for the others, and had them brought back to Portugal. And what he did to them is the detail that seals his reputation and tells you the depth of the wound. According to the chroniclers, Pedro had the 2 captured murderers executed by having their hearts torn out of their bodies while they were still alive. One man's heart ripped from his chest, the other's from his back, so that neither would have to look upon the vengeance, a deliberate and gruesome symmetry. Because Pedro is said to have declared they had torn out his heart when they killed Inés. He reportedly watched the executions while dining. Whether every detail is literal or burnished by horrified retelling, the core is consistent across the tradition. The king took his revenge on the killer's hearts, in payment for his own, but the vengeance, however savage, is not why this story is immortal. What makes it the strangest love story in the medieval canon is what Pedro did for Inés herself. Not to her killers, but for her, for the woman he had lost. And it is the scene that has haunted Portuguese imagination for 6 centuries. Pedro, now king, declared that Inés de Castro had in fact been his lawful wife all along. He announced that he had secretly married her years before in a private ceremony, and though no fully reliable record of the wedding survived, and the truth of it has been debated ever since, Pedro insisted upon it as a matter of royal fact, which meant that Inés had not been his mistress but his queen, and that her murder had been the killing not of a nobleman's lover, but of the anointed consort of the King of Portugal, and having established by royal declaration that Inés was his rightful wife and therefore Queen of Portugal, Pedro is said to have done the thing that turns the whole story from tragedy into legend. He had her body exhumed. Inés had been dead and buried for years by this point, and the king had her corpse taken from its grave, dressed in royal robes, and brought to the church, most tellingly to the monastery, where he had her placed upon a throne, crowned as queen, and then commanded the assembled court and nobility of Portugal to come forward, one by one, and pay homage to their dead queen by kissing her hand, the skeletal, decayed hand of a woman years in the grave, now crowned and enthroned in state. The court of Portugal was made to file past the corpse of the murdered woman and do reverence to her as their sovereign lady, because the king willed that she be given in death the crown that had been denied her in life. That is the image that has echoed down the centuries, of the crowned corpse on the throne and the living nobility bowing to kiss its hand. And it is worth pausing on how much of it we can actually stand behind, because it is exactly the kind of scene that grows in the retelling. The bare, well-attested facts are these: that Pedro loved Inés, that his father had her murdered as a threat to the realm, that Pedro rebelled and later, as king, took brutal revenge on her killers, and that he formally proclaimed Inez his lawful wife and queen and gave her a magnificent royal reburial. Pedro had 2 extraordinary matching tombs built for himself and Inez at the great Cistercian monastery of Alcobaça, 2 of the most beautiful pieces of Gothic funerary sculpture in all of Europe. Inez carved in stone with the crown of a queen, Pedro beside her, and, according to tradition, he had the tombs placed foot to foot rather than side by side, so that on the day of judgment, when the dead rise, the very first thing each of them would see upon opening their eyes would be the face of the other. Those tombs are real. You can go and stand between them at Alcobaça today. The coronation of the corpse and the kissing of the dead hand appears in the tradition, and in the later chronicles, and became the enduring heart of the legend, though historians debate how much of that specific macabre ceremony literally happened, and how much accreted over generations of retelling. And in a way, the uncertainty suits it, because this became less a documented event than a national myth, the founding love tragedy of Portugal, and it never stopped being retold. 2 centuries after Pedro, Portugal's greatest poet Luís de Camões enshrined the death of Inés as one of the most famous and moving passages in the national epic Os Lusíadas, giving her the immortal role of the innocent beauty destroyed by cold reasons of state, the woman who won a crown only after death. Playwrights and poets across Europe took up the story for centuries afterward. It became one of the most dramatized true events in Western literature, precisely because it fused the 2 things audiences can never resist, a great love and a great horror, into a single true image. The phrase that attached itself to Inés in Portuguese memory says it best and coldest. She is remembered as the queen who was crowned after death, a reina morta, the dead queen. Pedro I ruled Portugal for another decade after his revenge, a reign otherwise remembered as reasonably just and orderly, the harsh justiciar giving his kingdom sound if severe government. But no one remembers Pedro for his administration. They remember him for the woman he could not save, the killers whose hearts he tore out, and the crown he set upon a skull, a man who loved so fiercely and grieved so terribly that he tried, quite literally, to reach past death and give a dead woman the throne that living men had murdered her to keep from her. Chapter 6. The She-Wolf and Her Favourite. Most of the affairs we've walked through tonight brought down individuals, a scholar, a knight, a princess in a cold cell. This one brought down a king, took his crown off his head, and by most accounts ended with his death in a dungeon. It is the story of a queen who fell in love with an exiled baron, raised an army with him, invaded her own husband's kingdom, deposed that husband, and then ruled England alongside her lover for 3 years. And it is one of the only times in the entire Middle Ages that an adulterous couple didn't merely survive a scandal, but conquered a country with it. Her name was Isabella of France, and yes, she is the same Isabella from 2 chapters ago, the sharp-eyed daughter of Philip the Fair, who noticed the embroidered purses and lit the fuse on the Tour de Nesle scandal. She grew up to be the most formidable of all of Philip's children, and history has hung a memorable and not entirely fair name on her, the She-Wolf of France. To understand how a queen ends up invading her own kingdom, you have to understand the marriage she was trapped in, and to understand that, you have to meet her husband, Edward II of England, who is one of the most catastrophically unsuccessful kings ever to sit on the English throne, and whose personal life is the subject of our very next chapter. So I'll keep him in soft focus here, and hold the details of his great obsessions for their proper place. What matters for Isabella's story is this. She was married to Edward in 1308, at around 12 years old, a marriage arranged to make peace between England and France, and she arrived to find that her new husband's heart, attention, and lavish generosity were entirely absorbed by a favourite, a man named Piers Gaveston, to a degree that publicly humiliated her from the very start. At their wedding festivities, Edward reportedly lavished attention, and Isabella's own wedding gifts on Gaveston rather than his bride. The young queen found herself sidelined in her own marriage by a man her husband could not bear to be apart from. Isabella endured this, and endured Gaveston's eventual violent death at the hands of the barons, and endured the rise of the next set of royal favourites who replaced him, because Edward's pattern simply repeated. For years she played the role of the loyal, dignified queen as best she could, and even bore Edward 4 children, including the son who would matter most, the future Edward III. The favourites who broke the marriage beyond repair were a father and son, both named Hugh Despenser, the younger Despenser in particular becoming, by the 1320s, Edward II's new great favourite, and, in practical terms, the real power in England, a grasping, ruthless man who used his hold over the king to enrich himself and his family on an enormous scale, seizing lands, crushing rivals, and running the kingdom as his personal fief. And the younger Despenser was, crucially, an enemy of Isabella. He worked to poison her relationship with Edward, to reduce her influence, and eventually to strip her of her lands and income. When war broke out between England and France in the mid-1320s, Isabella, a Frenchwoman, the King of France's sister, was treated as a suspect enemy in her own adopted country, had her estates confiscated, her household broken up, her children partly taken from her control, and was reduced to a humiliating dependence. She later said in a famous and bitter image that someone had come between her and her husband, and that she felt as though a third person had intruded into her marriage, and she would wear the robes of mourning until she was avenged, casting Despenser as the intruder who had destroyed her marriage. By 1325, Isabella was a queen stripped of power and dignity, seething with genuine grievance, and she was about to be handed the one thing she needed to do something about it, an excuse to leave England. The excuse came dressed as diplomacy. The war with France needed settling, and Isabella, sister to the French king, Charles IV, the last of her brothers, the same Charles whose wife Blanche had been imprisoned for adultery in the Tour de Nesle affair, was the obvious person to send to Paris to negotiate peace, being both a royal envoy and family to the other side. Edward and the Despensers let her go, which was a spectacular misjudgment, because once Isabella was on French soil, in her brother's kingdom, out from under Despenser's control, she simply refused to come back. She had escaped, and she knew it, and she began, from the safety of the French, and later the continental courts, to build a coalition that would let her return not as a suppliant but as a conqueror. And it was in this period of exile, gathering around herself the other English exiles and malcontents who had fled Edward and the Despensers, that Isabella met, or rather connected deeply with, the man who would become her partner in love and in revolution, Roger Mortimer. Roger Mortimer was a powerful marcher lord, a baron of the wild, militarised borderlands between England and Wales, and he was one of the most dangerous enemies the Despensers had made. He had risen against Edward and the Despensers, been defeated, been imprisoned in the Tower of London under sentence of death, and then had done something almost no one did. He escaped the Tower, reportedly by drugging his guards and slipping out, and fled across the Channel to France. So by the time Isabella arrived in exile, Mortimer was already there, a proven soldier, a committed enemy of the regime that had wronged her, a charismatic and ruthless man with every reason to want Edward and the Despensers destroyed. Isabella and Mortimer became allies, and then they became lovers, and the affair was open enough to scandalise the courts of Europe. A married queen and an escaped condemned baron, living together and plotting the overthrow of her royal husband. The relationship was both a genuine passion and a formidable political partnership. In Mortimer, Isabella found a man who was her match in ambition and her superior in military experience, and together they made a team capable of doing what no one had managed in 20 years of English baronial revolt, actually toppling Edward II. They assembled the pieces with real strategic patience. The crucial one was Isabella's eldest son, Prince Edward, the heir to the English throne, then around 13. Isabella manoeuvred to get the boy sent to France on the pretext of paying homage to the French king for the English lands in France, and once she had the heir physically in her custody on the continent, the whole political calculus flipped, because now she controlled the future of the dynasty. She could act not as a rebel against the crown, but as the guardian of its rightful heir, moving to save the kingdom from the misrule of the Despensers in her son's name. She strengthened the alliance further by betrothing young Prince Edward to Philippa of Hainault, daughter of the Count of Hainault in the Low Countries, a match that came with a crucial dowry in the form of money, ships and mercenaries, the material means to mount an actual invasion. And so, in September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed on the coast of England at the head of a small invading army. A queen, her lover, her son the heir, and a force of continental mercenaries and English exiles, coming to overthrow the King of England. What happened next is the part that tells you how completely Edward II had destroyed his own support, because the invasion barely had to fight. Isabella and Mortimer landed expecting a hard campaign, and instead found the country falling into their hands almost without resistance. The nobles, the towns, the church, exhausted and disgusted by Edward and the rapacious dispensers, defected to the Queen in droves or simply stood aside. Edward's support evaporated so fast that within weeks he was a fugitive in his own kingdom, fleeing westward toward Wales with the younger dispenser, while Isabella's forces took London and city after city declared for her. The king and his favourite were run down and captured in South Wales in November. The younger Hugh Despenser, the great favourite, the intruder Isabella had sworn to be avenged upon, was subjected to a horrific public execution, dragged through the streets, hanged from an enormous height, then castrated and disembowelled while still alive, and finally beheaded and quartered. A traitor's death of maximum brutality, and Isabella and Mortimer are recorded as having dined while they watched. The intruder who had come between the Queen and her marriage was destroyed with the full theatrical cruelty of medieval treason justice, and the woman he had wronged was there to see it done. And then came the genuinely unprecedented part, the thing that had essentially never been formally done in England before. They didn't just defeat the king, they deposed him. Capturing a king was one thing. Medieval kingship was held to be sacred, an anointed office granted by God, and there was no clean, accepted legal procedure for simply removing an anointed king and replacing him. Isabella and Mortimer improvised one. In January 1327, a parliament was assembled, and under enormous pressure it declared Edward II deposed, forced in effect to abdicate in favour of his young son, on the grounds of his incompetence, his misrule, his reliance on evil favourites, and his failures as a king. Edward was made to give up the crown, reportedly under threat that if he did not abdicate in his son's favour, the crown might pass out of his family entirely. The boy became King Edward III at 14, and the real rulers of England, governing in the young king's name during his minority, were now Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, a queen, and the escaped baron she had taken up with in exile ruling the kingdom together, having removed her husband from his throne. It was, by any measure, an astonishing achievement. An adulterous couple had not been ruined by their affair, but had ridden it all the way to the mastery of a kingdom. The former king, meanwhile, was the loose end that could not be safely left lying around, and his fate is one of the enduring dark mysteries of English history. Edward II was imprisoned, moved between castles, and finally held at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, and in September 1327, a matter of months after his deposition, it was announced that he had died. The official story was natural causes. Almost no one believed it then, and few believe it now. The overwhelming likelihood, accepted by most historians, is that the deposed king was murdered on the orders of the new regime, of Isabella and Mortimer, or of Mortimer at least, because a living deposed king was a permanent danger, a rallying point for any future rebellion who might seek to restore him. And attached to Edward II's death is one of the most infamous and lurid stories in all of English history, the persistent later legend that he was murdered by having a red-hot iron thrust into his body, a killing method chosen, according to the gruesome logic of the tale, so as to leave no visible mark on the corpse and to mock, in the cruelest way, the sexual nature of his attachments to his favourites. It must be said plainly that this horrifying detail comes from later chronicles rather than from any contemporary record, that historians treat it with great scepticism, and that some now argue Edward may not have been murdered at that moment at all, or even that he may have escaped and lived on in obscurity abroad. The fate of Edward II is one of the genuinely unresolved puzzles of the period, but whatever the exact manner of it, a deposed king conveniently died in the custody of the couple, who had every reason to want him gone, and the throne was secured for the son and the lovers who ruled in his name. Isabella and Mortimer's triumph, though, contained the seed of its own ending, and the ending came from the very boy they had placed on the throne, because their rule was, in truth, not much better than the regime they had overthrown. Mortimer grew as grasping and arrogant and hated as the Despensers had been, accumulating titles and lands and wealth, making himself Earl of March, behaving with the swagger of a man who ruled a kingdom, while Isabella amassed a vast fortune of her own. And the young Edward III was growing up, watching his mother's lover lord it over the realm, watching Mortimer treat the king himself with something close to contempt, and nursing a resentment that sharpened as he came of age. In 1330, at 17, Edward III struck, In a swift, secret coup, the young king and a small band of loyal companions entered Nottingham Castle by night, famously, according to tradition, through a hidden underground passage that let them bypass the guards, burst into the chambers where Mortimer and Isabella were lodged and seized Mortimer by force. The favourite who had ruled England for 3 years was arrested in front of the Queen. Isabella is said to have cried out begging her son to have mercy on gentle Mortimer, but the young king had made his decision. Mortimer was taken to London, condemned by Parliament as a traitor, without even being allowed to speak in his own defence, the same denial he and Isabella had inflicted on the Despensers, and hanged at Tyburn like a common criminal. Isabella herself, though, her son did not destroy. She was his mother, and Edward III chose to protect her name and her dignity rather than put her on trial. The official story laid the blame on Mortimer, and quietly drew a veil over the Queen's own role. She was removed from power, her vast wealth largely stripped, and she was retired into a comfortable but politically neutered existence, living out her remaining decades in considerable state at her own residences, honoured as the King's mother, visited by her son, allowed to keep her rank and her comforts. She did not, contrary to a popular later myth, go mad or spend her life locked in a tower. She lived on for nearly 30 more years as a respected dowager, took the habit of a nun near the very end, and died in 1358, and was buried, in a final touch of complicated symbolism, in her wedding cloak, and by some accounts with the heart of her husband Edward II, the king she had deposed placed upon her breast. The she-wolf of France, who had loved a rebel baron and taken a kingdom for it, was laid to rest wrapped in the dress she had worn to marry the man she overthrew. Chapter 7. The King's Favourite. Nobody could explain. Last chapter, I kept a man in soft focus and promised to come back to him, and here he is. Edward II of England is one of the strangest figures to wear a medieval crown, and the reason the English baron spent his entire reign in a state of barely controlled fury has almost nothing to do with taxes or war or land in the ordinary way, and almost everything to do with the people he loved. Because Edward II loved his favourites, a small succession of men whom he raised up showered with wealth and titles and intimacy, and preferred above every earl and baron in his kingdom, and that love, whatever its exact nature, enraged the most powerful men in England so completely that they were willing to hunt those favourites down and kill them. Tonight is the story of the first and most famous of them, the one who defined the whole pattern, Piers Gaveston. Start with the historian's honest caveat because it matters, and because it's the most interesting thing about the whole affair. We do not actually know with certainty the precise nature of Edward's relationship with Gaveston. The medieval sources describe an extraordinary intimacy and devotion. Some contemporary chroniclers hint darkly at sin, one comparing the bond to that of David and Jonathan in the Bible, another suggesting the king loved Gaveston beyond measure and immoderately. Many modern historians read the relationship as a sexual and romantic one, a love affair between two men. Others argue it might have been an intense bond of sworn brotherhood, a formalised adoptive brotherhood of the kind medieval nobles sometimes entered, or simply an overwhelming favouritism. The truth is that the sources let us say, with confidence, that Edward loved Gaveston with an intensity that everyone around them found excessive and threatening, and that they leave the exact bedroom facts tantalisingly out of reach, and, crucially, that for the political catastrophe that followed, the exact facts barely mattered. What mattered was that the barons perceived a king who cared more for one man than for his entire nobility, his kingdom, and eventually his queen, and that perception was enough to get people killed. So I'll tell the story as the sources give it, as a love, in whatever form, powerful enough to break a reign. Piers Gaveston was not English. He was a Gascon, from Gascony, the English crown's territory in southwestern France, the son of a loyal but relatively minor knight in the service of Edward's father, Edward I, and that origin is the first spark of the whole conflict, because to the great English earls, men of ancient lineage and vast inherited estates, Gaveston was a foreign nobody, a jumped-up son of a minor Gascon knight with no business standing anywhere near the summit of English power. He was brought into the household of the young Prince Edward, Edward I's heir, and the two young men, close in age, formed an immediate and intense attachment. Gaveston was, by the accounts, everything the future king found dazzling. Athletic, quick-witted, elegant, a superb soldier and jouster, charming and arrogant in equal measure, with a gift for wounding mockery that would later cost him dearly. Old King Edward I saw the depth of his son's attachment and grew alarmed by it. Alarmed enough that at one point when the prince asked to grant Gaveston a significant title, the old king reportedly flew into a rage, physically assaulted his son, tore out fistfuls of his hair, and banished Gaveston from the realm. The father saw the danger coming and tried to cut it off at the root. It didn't take. Edward I died in 1307, and one of the very first acts of the new King Edward II, almost the instant the old king was cold, was to recall Gaveston from exile and begin the lavish elevation that would poison his entire reign. And the elevation was lavish to a degree that reads, even now, as a deliberate provocation. Edward made Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall, an earldom of enormous wealth and prestige normally reserved for members of the royal family itself, handed to the son of a minor Gascon knight. He arranged for Gaveston to marry his own niece, Margaret de Clare, tying the favourite by marriage into the royal family and the high aristocracy. He gave him lands, treasure, and custody of royal wealth, and most provocatively of all, in a gesture of almost breathtaking political tone-deafness, when Edward sailed to France to marry Isabella and to be crowned, he left Gaveston behind as regent, as keeper of the realm, ruling England in the king's absence, placing the foreign favourite above every ancient earl in the land. At the coronation itself, Gaveston was reportedly given the honour of carrying the crown, and appeared so gorgeously and outrageously bedecked in royal purple and pearls that the assembled nobility was scandalised, feeling he outshone the king, and worse, the new queen. The whole performance broadcast to every powerful man in England a single, unmistakable message. This outsider is loved above all of you, and there is nothing you can do about it. It was the surest possible way to unite the entire baronage in hatred, and it worked. What sharpened that hatred from resentment into something murderous was Gaveston's personality, because he was not content to be quietly, enormously favoured. He was witty and cruel and could not resist mocking the very men who most wanted him destroyed. Gaveston had a gift for the wounding nickname, and he aimed it squarely at the greatest earls of the realm, the men whose pride was their most precious possession. He is recorded as having tagged the powerful earls with mocking epithets that stuck and stung. The Earl of Warwick he is said to have called the Black Dog of Arden, the Earl of Lancaster, the king's own cousin, and the richest, most powerful noble in England, and others he pinned with insulting names that reduced these titans to figures of fun around the court. For proud magnates who already loathed being ranked beneath a Gascon upstart, being publicly ridiculed by that same upstart was intolerable. The Earl of Warwick, remembering the black dog jibe, is reported to have grimly promised that one day the dog would bite. These were not men who forgot an insult, and Gaveston, secure in the king's love, kept handing them out. He was, in the modern idiom, spectacularly bad at reading the room, a man with all the king's favour and none of the instinct for survival that should have come with knowing how many powerful enemies he was making. The barons moved against him again and again, and the reign became a grinding cycle of Gaveston being forced out and Edward pulling him back. In 1308, under enormous baronial pressure, Edward was compelled to exile Gaveston, but the king softened the blow by appointing him Lieutenant of Ireland, a grand posting, and then engineered his return within a year. In 1311, the barons, having forced the king to accept a set of reforming restrictions on his power, known as the Ordinances, made the permanent banishment of Gaveston one of their central demands, and Gaveston was exiled yet again, condemned as an evil influence on the crown, and yet again Edward could not bear it, and brought him back, this time in defiance of the barons' formal decree, which was the final provocation, because now the king had openly flouted the nobility's collective will for the sake of this one man, and the barons resolved that the only way to end the cycle was to end Gaveston himself. There would be no more exiles from which the king could simply recall him. This time they would make his removal permanent in the one way that could not be reversed. In 1312 the barons took up arms, and Gaveston, with the king, was pursued north. Edward and Gaveston were separated in the flight, a fatal separation, and Gaveston took refuge in Scarborough Castle, where, besieged and cut off, he was forced to surrender on terms that were supposed to guarantee his safety and a proper negotiation over his fate. Those terms were promptly betrayed. Gaveston, taken into custody, was being escorted south when the Earl of Warwick, the black dog who had not forgotten, seized him by force, carried him off to Warwick Castle, and there, together with a group of the other great earls, including the Earl of Lancaster, resolved to be rid of him for good. There was a hasty, extra-legal show of judgment, a gathering of magnates declaring the sentence they had already decided upon, and then, in June 1312, Piers Gaveston was taken out to Blacklow Hill, on land belonging to the Earl of Lancaster, and killed, run through with a sword and then beheaded, executed by the retainers of the earls he had mocked, on the authority of no court but their own collective will. The favourite who had carried the crown at the coronation and ruled England as regent was cut down on a hillside by the men he had nicknamed. The black dog had bitten at last. Edward's grief was, by all accounts, terrible and genuine, and it reveals the depth of the attachment more clearly than any of the lavish gifts had. The king was devastated, and, tellingly, he could not even immediately bury his favourite, because Gaveston had died excommunicate over an earlier dispute and could not be given Christian burial until the matter was resolved. So Gaveston's embalmed body lay unburied for over 2 years while Edward arranged for the excommunication to be lifted, and when the king was finally able to bury him in 1315, he did so with extraordinary lavishness at the Dominican Priory at King's Langley, in a grand ceremony attended by the king himself and a great gathering of clergy, sparing no expense to honour the dead man. Edward never forgave the earls responsible, and he nursed the grievance for years. When he finally, much later, managed to destroy the Earl of Lancaster, having him executed after a battle in 1322, many read it as the king's long-delayed revenge for Blacklow Hill, the settling of a decade-old score for the death of the man he had loved. Edward's devotion to Gaveston outlasted Gaveston's life by 15 years, and shaped the vendettas of his entire reign. And here is the detail that tells you the tragedy was structural, not personal, that Edward II was simply built to love a favourite this way, whatever the consequences. Because after Gaveston was dead and buried, Edward did the whole thing again. Within a few years he had found new favourites, and eventually settled his devotion on the Despensers, the father and son we met last chapter, and specifically on the younger Hugh Despenser, lavishing on him the same kind of favour, wealth, and power he had once heaped on Gaveston, with the same catastrophic results, the same baronial fury, the same alienation of the Queen, and ultimately the same violent end for the favourite, and this time for Edward's own reign. The pattern was identical, only the stakes were higher, because the younger Despenser was greedier and more politically dangerous than the charming, mocking Gaveston had ever been, and the Queen he alienated, Isabella, turned out to be a woman capable of raising an army. Edward II could not help himself. He needed a favourite to love and elevate above all others, and each time he did it, the kingdom's most powerful men closed ranks to destroy the man he had chosen, until at last they destroyed the king along with him. What lingers about the whole story is the sheer size of the reaction relative to whatever the thing actually was. The English baronage lived comfortably alongside kings who kept mistresses, kings who were cruel, kings who taxed and warred and made bad decisions. Those were the ordinary hazards of monarchy. But a king who loved one man above all of them, who raised that man over their heads and let him mock them, and could not be made to give him up even under threat of civil war, that they could not tolerate, and they killed for it, twice. Whatever passed between Edward and Gaveston in private, the public fact is unambiguous and rather moving in its way. A king was willing to defy his entire nobility, break formal decrees, and risk his throne rather than give up the man he loved, and he mourned that man for the rest of his life. The barons never wrote down in plain words exactly what they thought they were killing Gaveston for, and that silence, that inability or unwillingness to name the thing directly, is the most eloquent evidence we have that they understood perfectly well what they could not say. Chapter 9. The Pope's Daughter and Her 3 Husbands. We've spent most of tonight in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries. Now we jump forward to the very end of the Middle Ages, to Rome in the 1490s, and to a family whose name became, within its own lifetime and forever after, a synonym for corruption, poison, incest, and every luxurious sin the Renaissance imagination could conjure, the Borgias. And at the centre of the Borgia legend stands a young woman whose name has come down through 5 centuries as a byword for the beautiful, deadly femme fatale, Lucrezia Borgia, rumoured poisoner, rumoured seductress of her own father and brothers, the woman with the ring full of venom. The trouble, and the reason this chapter is more interesting than the legend, is that almost none of the most lurid things everyone knows about Lucrezia are true. And the things that are true, the documented realities of her 3 marriages, are scandalous enough on their own without any invented poison at all. This is a story about the gap between what a family actually did and what a hostile world gleefully said they did, and both halves are worth your attention. Start with the family, because you cannot understand Lucrezia without understanding the machine she was born into. The Borgias were originally Spanish, the Borja family from Valencia, and they clawed their way to the summit of the Italian church through a combination of ability, ruthlessness, and shameless nepotism. In 1492, Lucrezia's father, Rodrigo Borgia, was elected pope, taking the name Alexander VI, and he was one of the most worldly, ambitious, and openly corrupt men ever to hold the office. A pope who bought his election through bribery, kept mistresses, and, most relevantly for our story, had fathered several children whom he openly acknowledged and shamelessly promoted. Because that is the first genuinely scandalous fact, and it's a documented one. Lucrezia was the daughter of the Pope. The supposedly celibate head of Western Christendom had a family, and he used that family as instruments of his dynastic ambition, exactly as any secular prince used his children. Lucrezia's brothers included the notorious Cesare Borgia, soldier, cardinal-turned-warlord, the ruthless prince whom Machiavelli would later study and half admire as a model of cold political effectiveness. And Lucrezia, the beautiful daughter, born in 1480, was the piece on the board that her father moved to make marriage alliances repeatedly as the shifting politics of Italy demanded, which is how a young woman ended up with 3 husbands before she was out of her 20s, each marriage made and unmade according to what her father and brother needed at that moment. Her first marriage was arranged when she was 13, in 1493, the year after her father became pope. She was married to Giovanni Sforza, a member of the powerful Sforza family that ruled Milan, in an alliance meant to bind the new pope to Milanese power. But Italian politics in the 1490s shifted with bewildering speed, and within a few years the alliance with the Sforza had lost its value to Alexander VI. Indeed, the Sforza connection had become a liability as the Borgias' interest realigned. So the pope decided the marriage had to go. And the way he dissolved it is the first of the great documented scandals of Lucrezia's life, an episode of such brazen cynicism that it damaged everyone involved. Alexander VI sought an annulment on the grounds that the marriage had never been consummated, that Giovanni Sforza was impotent, and that Lucrezia therefore remained a virgin, leaving the marriage legally void and dissolvable. Giovanni Sforza was understandably enraged at being publicly declared sexually incapable, and he fought the claim. But the Borgia machine was immovable, and to save himself he was ultimately pressured into agreeing to the humiliating declaration. He got his revenge, though, in the currency of the age. Rumour, furious at the Borgias, Giovanni Sforza is credited with launching one of the most poisonous accusations ever made against the family. He suggested that the real reason the Pope wanted Lucrezia back, unmarried, was that Alexander wanted her for himself, that the annulment was a cover for incest between the Pope and his daughter. There is no evidence whatsoever that this was true. It was, by every serious historian's reckoning, the slander of a humiliated, discarded husband, striking back at the family that had emasculated him in public. But it was too lurid and too delicious not to spread, and it stuck to Lucrezia's name for 500 years. The incest legend was born not from any act of hers, but from a vengeful ex-husband's parting shot. And here is the detail that turns the annulment from merely cynical into genuinely grotesque, the part that reveals how completely the Borgias would bend reality to their needs. The entire annulment rested on the sworn claim that Lucrezia was a virgin, that the marriage had never been consummated. But at the very time this claim of untouched virginity was being solemnly advanced and certified, Lucrezia was, according to strong and widely accepted contemporary evidence, pregnant. The dates are deeply awkward for the official story. A child, a boy who became known as the Infans Romanus, the Roman child, appears in the historical record around this period, a child whose paternity was the subject of frantic Borgia obfuscation, with the family issuing not one but 2 contradictory secret papal bulls about whose son the boy actually was. So the church, headed by Lucrezia's own father, formally certified the intact virginity of a woman who was visibly or soon to be visibly with child. A piece of official fiction so bold it beggars belief the papacy itself deployed to launder the family's inconvenient biology. Who the father of the Roman child actually was remains genuinely uncertain to this day, and has never been resolved. The theories run from a Borgia servant to Cesare to Alexander himself, and the truth is simply lost behind the family's deliberate smokescreen. What is certain is that the founding legal premise of Lucretia's first divorce was a lie, and everyone at the time who could count knew it. Her second marriage, arranged in 1498 when she was 18, was to Alfonso of Aragon, a young nobleman connected to the royal house of Naples. A handsome match made when the Borgias' interest had swung toward an alliance with Naples, and by the accounts one that Lucrezia was genuinely happy in. Alfonso was young, good-looking and well-liked, and Lucrezia appears to have loved him. She bore him a son. But the same force that had destroyed her first marriage destroyed her second, and this time it was not merely dissolved but drenched in blood because Italian politics shifted yet again. The Borgias' alliances realigned once more, away from Naples and toward France, and Alfonso of Aragon, the Neapolitan husband, became, exactly as Giovanni Sforza had before him, an inconvenient liability tying the family to the wrong side. But where the first husband had been merely humiliated into an annulment, the second was dealt with far more permanently, and the prime suspect was Lucrezia's own brother. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked one night on the steps of St. Peter's by assassins and gravely wounded, though he survived the initial assault. He was carried to safety and slowly nursed back toward health by Lucrezia and his own people, and then, while he was recovering in his sickbed within the Vatican itself, men came in and finished the job. Alfonso was strangled in his bed. The murder was widely and openly attributed to Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, who was believed to have ordered the killing to clear away a husband who no longer suited the family's French-leaning strategy. Lucrezia, by the accounts, was devastated by the murder of a husband she had loved. She went into real and visible mourning, and the killing seems to have marked a turning point, the moment the human cost of being a Borgia daughter came fully home to her. She had been widowed at 20 by her own brother's hand, her happy marriage terminated by strangulation for reasons of state. Her third marriage, in 1501, took her at last out of Rome and out of the direct orbit of her father and brother, and it is the one that reveals the woman behind the legend most clearly. She was married to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duke of Ferrara, a marriage to one of the oldest and most distinguished ruling houses of Italy, a genuine dynastic prize, arranged with an enormous dowry and considerable manoeuvring because the proud Este family was frankly reluctant to take a bride with Lucrezia's already lurid reputation and dubious Borgia blood into their ancient line. But the match was made, and Lucrezia went north to Ferrara to become in time its duchess. And there, away from Rome, out of reach of the machine that had made and unmade her, she became a different figure entirely and a genuinely admirable one. As Duchess of Ferrara, she proved to be an intelligent, capable and respected ruler. She was a notable patron of the arts and of poets and scholars, presiding over one of the most cultured courts in Italy, corresponding with humanists, patronizing artists, and even, on occasion, effectively governing the state in her husband's absence. She grew increasingly pious in her later years, involved herself in charitable works and religious foundations, and earned real affection and respect from the people of Ferrara. The poisoner and seductress of legend spent the last 17 years of her life as a competent, cultured, well-loved Renaissance duchess who died in 1519 at the age of 39, from complications following childbirth after bearing numerous children. A thoroughly ordinary and rather tragic death for a woman the world remembered as a monster. So we have to reckon, finally, with the gap. The difference between the Lucrezia the world invented and the Lucrezia the documents actually show, because that gap is the real subject of this chapter. The legend gives us Lucrezia Borgia the poisoner, wearing a hollow ring filled with venom to slip into her enemy's wine. Lucrezia, the incestuous lover of her father the Pope and her brother Cesare. Lucrezia the Black Widow, the femme fatale at the centre of the Borgia orgies, a woman of monstrous and knowing evil. And the documented record gives us something quite different, and, in its way, sadder. A woman married off 3 times before 30 by a father and brother who treated her as a diplomatic instrument, whose first marriage was annulled on a lie about her virginity while she was pregnant, whose second husband was strangled by her own brother when the political winds changed, and who, when finally set free of her terrifying family, turned out to be a cultured, pious and genuinely capable ruler, beloved by her subjects. The evidence for the poisonings is essentially non-existent. The incest was the invention of a vengeful discarded husband. The image of the venomous seductress was manufactured by the Borgia's many powerful enemies who had every political motive to blacken the family's name and found in the beautiful thrice-married daughter of a corrupt pope an irresistible target. She was far more the victim of her family's ruthless scheming than its perpetrator, a pawn, not a queen, on the Borgia board. And yet, because the Honest Guide has to hold both truths at once, it isn't quite as simple as a wronged innocent smeared by propaganda, and that's what keeps the story genuinely interesting, rather than merely a tidy exercise in myth-busting. The documented Borgia reality was authentically dark, even stripped of every invented poisoning. A pope with a brood of acknowledged children he moved like chess pieces. A brother, Cesare, who really did have his sister's husband strangled in a Vatican sickbed. A family that really did deploy the machinery of the church to certify a pregnant woman's virginity. A Rome that really was, under Alexander VI, a theatre of bribery, murder and dynastic ruthlessness. Lucrezia herself grew up entirely inside that world and cannot have been wholly ignorant of how it worked. She was a Borgia, moving through Borgia Rome, and however much of a pawn she was a knowing and intelligent one. The truth about her, then, is neither the venomous monster of legend nor a spotless martyr, but something more human and more melancholy. A clever, resilient woman handed an appalling family and an impossible position, who was used badly by the men who should have protected her, who was slandered viciously by the men who hated them, and who, given finally a little distance and a little freedom in Ferrara, made of herself something genuinely worthy that the poison ring legend has spent 5 centuries obscuring. The most scandalous thing about Lucrezia Borgia turns out to be how thoroughly the scandal was manufactured, and how the real woman underneath it got lost. Chapter 10. The Mistress Who Ran a Kingdom. We've reached the last of our stories, and I want to close on the theme that has been humming quietly underneath every chapter tonight. The idea that these affairs were never just affairs, never merely gossip or bedroom scandal, but were again and again genuine engines of power. So let's end with a woman who embodies that truth more nakedly than almost anyone. A woman of low birth who became the mistress of an aging king, and through that position and nothing else, made herself one of the most powerful people in England, wealthy beyond reason, feared by the nobility, and hated enough that Parliament itself eventually rose up to destroy her. Her name was Alice Perrers, and she is the perfect figure to close on, because she strips the whole business down to its bones. No romance of doomed lovers here, no poetry, no crown placed on a corpse. Just a shrewd, ambitious woman who understood that proximity to a king was the most valuable commodity in the medieval world, and who cashed it in for everything it was worth. Set the scene, because the king in question was not the vigorous young monarch of most love stories, but a great ruler in his long, sad decline. Edward III of England, the very same Edward III who, as a boy of 17, had crept into Nottingham Castle to overthrow his mother, Isabella, and her lover Mortimer, closing the circle of one of our earlier chapters, had grown up to become one of the most successful and admired kings in English history. The warrior monarch of the early 100 Years' War, Victor of Crécy, founder of the Order of the Garter, who reigned for an astonishing 50 years. But by the 1360s and 1370s he was an old man in decline, and the decline was hastened by grief. His beloved queen, Philippa of Hainaut, the same Philippa whose marriage dowry had helped fund Isabella's invasion decades before, and who had been by all accounts a genuinely loving and steadying presence at Edward's side for over 40 years, grew ill and died in 1369. And it was in the shadow of the aging king's decline and his wife's final illness and death that Alice Perrers rose, because she had entered the royal household as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Philippa herself, and from that modest position she caught the attention of the king. Alice's origins were genuinely humble, and this is central to why the nobility loathed her so intensely. Her exact background is murky. The hostile chroniclers who are our main sources delighted in emphasising how low-born she was, and while some of that may be exaggeration meant to degrade her, she was unquestionably a woman of no great family, possibly the daughter of a tiler or a small tradesman, who had no business by the rules of her world rising anywhere near the summit of power. She was, by the accounts, not conventionally beautiful. One famous chronicler sniffed that she was not particularly attractive, and had risen purely through her cleverness and her seductive, persuasive tongue, rather than her looks, which if anything makes her achievement more impressive, because she rose on wits alone. She became Edward III's mistress while Queen Philippa still lived, bore the king several children, and after Philippa's death in 1369 her position became dominant, unchallenged, and increasingly brazen. With no queen to check her and an aging, weakening, infatuated king to influence, Alice Perez set about accumulating wealth and power on a scale that scandalized the entire realm. And accumulate she did, with a rapacious efficiency that even her enemies had to grudgingly document in detail. Alice used her influence over the besotted old king to acquire an enormous portfolio of property. She is recorded as having gained the ownership of dozens of manors, estates, and properties scattered across many counties of England, along with valuable wardships and other lucrative assets, building a personal fortune of staggering size for a woman of her origins. She extracted jewels and treasure. She's said to have received from the king a significant portion of the late Queen Philippa's own jewels, which reads as a particularly pointed insult to the dead queen she had once served, and most damaging to the realm's sense of justice. She is credited with meddling directly in the machinery of the law, sitting in or beside the courts to influence cases in which she or her allies had an interest, using her closeness to the king to bend legal judgments in her favour and in favour of those who paid for her patronage. This was the accusation that stung the political nation most deeply, not merely that a low-born mistress was rich, but that she was corrupting the king's justice itself, that the courts of England could be swayed by a woman whispering in the ear of a doting old king. She became the visible symbol of everything that had gone rotten in the twilight of a once glorious reign. There is a story about Alice at the height of her power that captures the sheer audacity of her, and while historians debate exactly how literally to take it, it has become the enduring image of her ascendancy. In 1375, it was said, a great tournament was held at Smithfield in London, and Alice Perez presided over it, riding through the streets in a triumphal procession, gorgeously arrayed, cast in the role of the Lady of the Sun, the Queen of the festivities, occupying the place of honour that ought to have belonged to a Queen of England. The image of the low-born royal mistress parading publicly as the Lady of the Sun, taking the ceremonial place of the dead Philippa at the centre of a great royal spectacle, broadcast her dominance to the whole kingdom in exactly the way Gaveston's coronation finery had broadcast his, a public claiming of a status she had no birthright to hold. Whether or not every detail of the Smithfield procession is precise, it perfectly expresses what Alice had become, a woman of the tradesman class occupying, in all but name, the position of queen consort, and utterly unafraid to be seen doing it. But power built entirely on the favour of one aging, failing king is power, with an expiration date, and Alice's enemies were only waiting for the moment they could strike. That moment came in 1376, in the assembly that later generations named, admiringly, the Good Parliament. By 1376, Edward III was visibly failing, sunk in his final decline, and his capable heir, the Black Prince, was himself dying. The government had fallen into the hands of a corrupt and unpopular court faction, and the political nation had had enough. The Good Parliament, the longest parliament yet held, mounted an unprecedented assault on the corruption around the throne, and it was in this parliament that the Commons developed the very procedure of impeachment, the mechanism by which the king's ministers could be formally accused and tried for their misdeeds, a genuinely important constitutional innovation born in this moment of reforming fury, and one of the central targets of the Good Parliament's wrath was Alice Perez. She was denounced for her greed, her corruption of justice, and her malign influence over the king. Specific charges were levelled at the fortune she had extracted, and the legal cases she had meddled in. Parliament passed an ordinance banishing her from the king's presence and stripping her of her ill-gotten gains, formally condemning the low-born mistress who had risen so high, a remarkable thing, a National Assembly reaching directly into the king's private life to tear his mistress away from him. Yet Alice Perez was nothing if not resilient, and her story does not end with that first fall, which is part of what makes her such a fitting figure to close on. She simply refused to stay down. The Good Parliament's reforms proved short-lived. Once it dispersed, the court faction reasserted itself, its acts were substantially reversed, and Alice returned to the side of the ageing king, resuming her place and her influence in the final months of Edward III's life as though nothing had happened. She was there at the very end in 1377, when the old king lay dying, and here we reach the single most infamous image attached to her name, the story that, true or not, has defined her for 600 years. According to the hostile chronicle tradition, as Edward III lay on his deathbed, abandoned and near death, Alice Perez remained at his side not out of devotion but out of avarice, and at the final moment, with the king dying or newly dead, and the room emptying of those who had fled a lost cause, she's said to have stripped the very rings from the dying king's fingers and slipped away with them, looting the corpse of the man whose favour had made her, taking the last valuables off his hands before his body was even cold. It is a grim and vivid picture, and modern historians rightly caution that it comes from writers who despised her and had every reason to paint her as a heartless scavenger. It may well be a slander, a final act of character assassination against a woman the chroniclers loved to hate, but whether literal fact or vengeful legend, the image of the rings taken from the dead king's hands has attached itself to Alice Perez permanently, the perfect dark emblem of a relationship that had always been, at bottom, transactional. After Edward III's death, Alice's protection died with him, and the new reign moved against her. She was tried, condemned, and had much of her vast fortune confiscated. Though even then, true to form, she spent years afterward fighting through the courts to recover what she could, litigating relentlessly for her lost properties, and she did claw a portion of it back before she died around 1400, a survivor to the very end. And I find it worth pausing as we close to resist the easy contempt the chroniclers want us to feel, because Alice Perez was operating within a system that gave a woman of her birth virtually no other route to power or security at all. She had no lineage to trade on, no lands, no army, no path through the church or the guilds to real wealth and influence. What she had was intelligence, nerve, and the one opening the age left ajar for a clever woman, the favour of a powerful man. And she worked that single opening for everything it could yield, with a ruthlessness we would call admirable in a man clawing his way up by any other means. She was greedy and grasping, certainly, and she corrupted what she touched. But she was also a woman playing a rigged game with the only pieces she was allowed to hold, and playing it better than almost anyone. And that, really, is the note I want to leave you on, because it draws together everything we've wandered through tonight. Every one of these affairs, Abelard and Eloise in their schoolroom, Eleanor riding away from one king toward another, Theodora rising from the hippodrome to the purple, the princesses in the Tour de Nesle, Pedro crowning his murdered love, Isabella landing with her army, Edward defying a kingdom for Gaveston, the troubadours singing their bylaws of illicit love, Lucrezia moved around the board by her terrible family, and Alice taking the rings from a dying king's hand. Every one of them was, underneath the passion and the scandal and the sometimes unbearable cruelty, about the same thing. That love, in a world where marriages were treaties and bloodlines were the constitution, and a queen's fidelity was load-bearing infrastructure for the state, was never a private matter. It was power. It made kings and unmade them, started wars and ended dynasties, raised tradesmen's daughters to thrones, and sent princesses to freeze in stone cells. And the people caught up in it were not the flat, stiff figures of the tapestries. They were as reckless and tender and foolish and calculating and heartbroken as anyone you know, doing the most human thing there is, falling for the wrong person at the worst possible moment, in a world that punished it with a severity we can barely imagine. There's something oddly comforting in that, I think, at this hour. However complicated your own heart feels tonight, you are in very old and very distinguished company. So thank you truly for spending this long night with me and with these tangled, passionate, long-dead people who turned out to be so much like us. If you drifted off somewhere back around the troubadours, that's all right. That's rather the point, and the stories will still be here when you come back to them. If you're still awake, let the lamp go dark now, and let all these kings and queens and lovers settle back into their tombs at Fontevraud and Alcobaça and Père Lachaise, where they've been waiting out the centuries, foot to foot, so that the first thing they'll see is each other. Rest well, sleep gently, and I'll see you in the next long, quiet night, whenever you need somewhere calm to lay your thoughts down. Good night.